there's some attendance there, but I think it has more to do with the Capstone exhibition tonight, and that there is a New York City trip for photojournalists. So I hope if you are exhibiting tonight, I look forward to seeing your work in an hour and a half, because I will be walking over there and checking out all of the BFA's lovely accomplishments. I thought, looking around the room, that those of you who did show up in person today should get maybe a little bit of extra credit. So if you can initial by your name, I decided this like literally half a minute ago to determine the extent of the extra credit yet, but I will do something along those lines. Congratulations. Thank you for being here. And always a pleasure. Other class business is that I will release the grades for your exhibition reviews tomorrow. I just thought they're done. I just thought I'd wait until you have turned in your midterms before you start thinking about exhibition reviews. Since that's due tonight at midnight. And the other thing is that I realized this afternoon that the lecture, Tuesday's lecture that I posted, didn't make it onto my courses somehow. It's my courses, as some of you know, since I was finished to drop files. If anybody emailed me about it, I didn't get it. I figured out today when I checked. So here's what we're going to do. Today, I'm going to talk about conceptual art and photography, and kind of go a little further. And basically, today's lecture does not assume that you've already seen Tuesday's lecture, obviously. So I'm going to teach today, see how far I got, and then record the second lecture for the week tomorrow or Saturday and post that. So it's a little out of order, but you still get the same amount of class content, equal bang for your buck, as it were. As I said that out loud, I decided I don't like that expression. Yeah, so I'll let you know when it's posted. At some point over the next week, I'll also be putting some midterm participation for yourself. That way you can take a look at where you are in the class so far. You'll have your exhibition review, grade, your midterm participation, of course, can change. If participation improves or decreases, and we'll get your midterm grades back to you within 2 weeks of you posted. Any questions? Past business wise? All right. Cool. Well, I hope you all have a wonderful spring break. And that you relaxed or got a lot of work done or had a lot of fun. And whatever it was that you needed from me, I hope you got it. All right. So this week, what we're looking at is we're back in the United States. We're looking at another movement. This is also a global movement. I'm focusing on the U.S. at least today. In the 1960s and 1970s. It has a number of similarities with the fine art photography that we discussed a few weeks ago. It's also based in the university in a lot of ways, and it's also kind of coming out of ideas about what art is. So you've heard about fine art photography. I'm going to turn the lights down. As you see in the example from Lee Friedlander on the right. And this is photography that where the people who make it are photographers, who are trained to be photographers, and they believe that the medium can be an artwork when the photographer establishes him or themselves as an artist. It's based, an organization that's very much based on this idea and really fueled the movement. Sorry, there's ever on Zoom. Can you turn your mic off? Okay, so it's very much based in photographers who believe that photography can be and should be appreciated as a fine art medium. That the photographic image, such as Lee Freeland or Doughboy, Stanford, Pennsylvania, is an artwork. It's because photography is often used for non-art purposes, as we know, from mugshot to criminal evidence to Instagram, right? There's always going to be a fair amount of talking to our context added to establish that a photograph is an artwork. For fine art photography, what that usually meant is that the artist or author or photographer had to be seen as having a creative vision. In exhibitions like Photographer's Eye on the top or New Documents on the bottom, all of this is about getting the viewer to appreciate what's special about a photographer's vision. And it distances, it makes a distinction between practicing the art of photography, which is something artists do, and being a member of the public that is not an artist and appreciates photography, right? So it's dividing the lookers, collectors, the audience, the artists, everybody that's involved in photographs for art into two separate camps. There's artists, there's a public who appreciates art, but they're not about artists. So, conceptual art is a little different. First off, conceptual art like John Baldessari's Wrong from 1967, these are artists who are trained not as photographers and were not ever really particularly interested, at least originally, in photography. John Baldessari, who you see on your right, I believe started off as a painter. And they started a movement called conceptual art that ends up using photography a lot, but they don't hang out with the fine art photographers. And in fact, they're interested in photographs because they don't think the medium's very art-like. Right, so John Baldessari's Wrong from 1967, he's playing around with the meanings or concepts of photography. Point out this is a wrong photograph. It looks like the trees coming out of the top of the sky. Right? So I'm playing around with what photography does to our understanding of the real. But this is more about, or at least the Baldessari and people who agree with him, about the idea of photography rather than creating an object, a fine art object. Now, if that doesn't sound clear, let me go on. It's a big category. Silhouette is where you see on the right. It's an image of his sculpture, serial project number 1, which is sort of a three-dimensional grid thing. He's known as the grandfather of conceptual art, and a sort of paradigmatic definition that we use is, as you see above, which says, I will refer to the kind of art in which I'm involved as conceptual art. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. So that's the central line, right? What the artist creates is not an object, it's not an image, it's an idea. anything that results from that idea is secondary to the idea itself. So for example, in serial project number 1, which you'll see above, the work has been what we call dematerialized, or demattered, right? There's no matter. This particular sculpture, as an object in and of itself, doesn't even exist anymore, right? LeWitt or his assistant constructed it based on LeWitt's idea, his instructions. And then at the end of the month or so, when people go look at, they took it down. Insofar as you can kind of purchase this work, you would purchase a piece of Xerox paper, which like, yeah, this is the work, and you can build it yourself, right? So the object itself is not important, it's the idea, right? And so that is sort of key aspect 1, or characteristic 1 of conceptual art, and that is what's called the dematerialization of the art object. In this case, the photograph is secondary, right? It's photographing an artwork, and it's a document of the thing, and not the thing itself, right? Because the art object has been dematerialized. So these are artists who are using photographs very often as documents for things that at some point don't exist anymore. The ghost in the machine here. For those of you on Zoom, the lights just went out. I don't randomly say ghost in the machine. And then the second, which I'm going to turn to in a few minutes, is what we call the death of the author. So, I mean, the author doesn't actually die. We're all still alive. But so in terms of dematerialization, here are some examples. One is Douglas Hubler, who, following this idea of no more art objects, says, the world is full of objects more or less interesting. I do not wish to add any more. I prefer simply to state the existence of things in terms of time and or place. So, for example, Hubler's Dresden piece number 6 from 1968 was the sort of square or rectangle of dirt put in front of a door. And then it was left there for a couple of hours. Every, I think, half-hour intervals, took a photograph. So what you see after a couple of hours is just dirt everywhere. It doesn't exist anymore. And what you see are these photographs that are left over from the work in which this thing is photographed every half hour. And a textual explanation explaining what the work was. Or Eleanor Anton's work, Carving, in which Anton went on a kind of nuts diet. So it wasn't a diet composed of nuts, it was a very rigorous diet in which she didn't eat very much for about 30 days. And she did like a lot of workouts. It was like 1972, and back then people thought smoking cigarettes helped you lose weight, so she smoked a lot of cigarettes too, apparently. It doesn't work, by the way. I do not recommend smoking cigarettes for any reason whatsoever. Please don't do that. And so she did that for 30 days, lost like 10 pounds or something. And every day she took a photograph. You can see them in the columns here. From the front, back, each profile. So this is actually a lot bigger. I just can't reproduce it easily. The slide thing goes on for quite a ways. And these are like 8 by 10 photographs. You can imagine how big this thing is in person. And here, the photographs, again, are not the object. Right? The object is, in fact, Eleanor Anton's body. And the way that she's titled it, Carving a Traditional Sculpture, is a play on the sort of traditional Western art idea You get a block of marble. Michelangelo goes to the block, carves out, David or whatever else Michelangelo carved. I don't mean self-flip that. I don't care. I see some of you laughing, some of you look shocked. Michelangelo's cool, just not my focus today. And in any event, right? So Anthony's like, well, if a dude can sculpt a block of marble, dieting is basically carving away the body. So here I am, carving into traditional sculpture that's done vis-a-vis a diet, right? But she herself is not, right? After this thing is done, we can't go and buy Eleanor Anthony's body as an art object. That would be horrific, right? Nobody can do that. Right, so there is the object itself has been dematerialized or dislocated in some way. Right, there's no painting. Insofar as there is an object, it's documentation of the event. Other examples, and I'm only giving the 3 of many, right, are in John Baldessari's cremation project from 1970. So Baldessari had been a painter in Southern California. He was a professor at UC San Diego, along with Eleanor Anthony. In the 1970s, he was like, I'm going to take every object in my studio and cremate it. So you can see here he is working with people who do cremations. He puts out an advertisement in the San Diego Union Tribune that says, it's kind of amusingly bureaucratic sounding. And Baldessari says, being first duly sworn, deposes and says, notice is hereby given that all works of art done by the undersigned between May 1953 and March 1966 in his possession as of July 24, 1970, were cremated. Signed John Baldessari, National City, California. That was it. You stopped making quote-unquote objects, but again, we do have the documentation. He then went on to teach at CalArts a class called Post-Studio. This is another sort of approach to dematerialization, right? Because if you work outside your own studio, you're not making objects, you're working out in the world, right? And so he would have his students do assignments like the following. Assignment number 1, make up an art game. Structure a set of rules with which to play. A physical game is not necessary. More important are the rules and their structure. Do we in life operate by rules? Does all art? Or art rules, like tenant rules or art violations? Assignment number 2, how can plants be used in art? Problem becomes, how can we really get people to look freshly at plants as if they've never noticed them before? A few possibilities, arranged them alphabetically. Plant them like popsicle trees. Include objects among plants that is camouflage. Assignment number 6, disguise an object to look like another object. You guys get the idea. All of these are things you may do out in the world. They certainly don't have to exist for a long time. And once you do them, it's over. It's almost more like the artist is crafting an experience than they've made a particular object. I know that you guys as art students may have seen assignments like this before, but that's kind of coming out of what John Baldessari did, right? Extraordinarily influential professor of art. Any questions? So conceptual art, of just being like an art about ideas, is a huge category, right? We can talk about, the sort of specific conceptual art movement of the late 1960s, But you could also say that anything done since Duchamp kind of counts as conceptual art. So people argue about this category all the time. And there's a lot of subcategories. So there's land art, the earthworks that you see above, or performance art that you see on the right. And both of these use a lot of photographs. How have you seen images of Robert Smithson's spiral Betty? Okay. So I'll just tell you, you're looking at an aerial view of a monumental earthwork. So Smithson took a bulldozer at some lake out in Utah, so it's very far away, and he kept kind of building up rocks until it made the spiral. It's still there. You can go out there and see it in person if you want. You have to get permission now. It's like a heritage site. So earthworks are often in very remote places, and usually very big. And performance art is a performance, and again, you'll see a lot of photographs because once the performance is over, how are you going to look at it? So in both of these cases, you can talk about the dematerialization of the art object, but there is an object, it's a photograph, right? Because how else are you going to look at it? Right? There's some form of documentation that we, as a group, are looking at. Very few of us, I mean, I've never been, are going to go out to the middle of Utah and go see spiral jetty. Right? It is cool, as I understand, but like, I don't have the money or time to fly out like to whatever the closest airport is, and then hop in a truck and get permission from the state or whatever. The whole thing is a whole thing. And so the only real access that most of us have to this work, or really any report, is through photographs of it. Same thing with performances like Canada's Name on the Impaired Scroll, which, and then talk about more in a little bit, but Schneemann kind of covered herself in various fluids, removed the scroll from her vagina and started reading it. So that's what you see above you. And the text that she read is on either side of that image. Now, unless somebody reenacts the performance for you, which has been done, but for the most part, we know about this work through its documentation, through the one object that it says. So it's such a kind of an interesting double, or like a simultaneous presence and absence, that we have the document suggest that the work is absent, it's far away, right? Like we don't get to have a direct experience of the thing, right? But instead, we have a photograph of it. So that's kind of, but we do have that photograph, so it's just kind of weird because it's there and yet it's not there. It's close to us, so we can hold it in our hand, and yet it's far away. We can see artists start to play around with this idea of sort of simultaneous presence and absence. One of my favorites are the earthworks of Autumn Mendieta. And these are works that, when Mendieta made them, right, they're ostensibly made for herself. She didn't have an audience. She went out into some rural kind of outdoor area and dug a hole that was about the shape of her body, so the silhouette or silhouette of her body. And it's just her, and playing around in the outdoors. And then she photographs it, right? Or she creates this sort of a flaming outline of her body, sets it on fire, photographs that, right? So the original object or intervention in the landscape was never available to a viewer or an audience, right? All we have is the documentation of it, in kind of a funny way. Not funny ha-ha, but funny ah, right? Mendieta has capitalized on that, right? Because she leaves the impression of her body as if she's there, but she's also not in the image. She's taking a photograph of the impression that her body is made. So we start seeing this play with what photographs can do. Whereas in something like Smithson's spiral jetty or Sneymon's interior scroll, both of these use photographs in what seems like a sort of matter-of-fact document way, right? That they made the thing and they took a photograph of it. And you're reading the photograph as a transparent window onto the thing that happened, and not as an object. And we've talked about this in photography a lot. But then as we start seeing artists capitalize on what photography kind of does or can do for their work. So not just Anna Mendieta, but somebody like Robert Schmidtchen, and this is the same Schmidtchen as Spiral Jetty, creates a work called Incidents of Air Travel in the Yucatan. This work, you're looking at it in the only object that we have that exists still, which was an article in the art magazine Art Forum. And what Schmidtchen did is, in April of 1969, he went with his wife, the artist Nancy Holt, and her sister, and they traveled in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is in Mexico, by car and plane and dugout. And they went visiting Mayan sites that were first documented by some white dude whose name I'm forgetting, in 1839. At each of these sites, Schmidtchen put a set of mirrors onto the ground and then photographed it. And what you see here in this map, though, is kind of a little hard to read even when you're up close, but it maps out where the sites are. So the Yucatan Peninsula, has anybody been? Okay, well, it's big. I'd say it's about the size of the state of Texas, at least, if not bigger. Big state, and these sites are all spread out. And in each of these, you've got the mirror. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating about that is that it does have this way of collapsing space, right? It reflects. What is that? Right? It reflects the sky. And it brings the sky miles and miles of space up there, right flat onto a almost two-dimensional surface of the ground. So just that action itself compresses miles of distance into a few inches of surface, right? Make sense? Okay. Not only that, but for Smithson, this is the work, and it kind of telescopes or compresses weeks of his travel, where he went around this whole, must have taken at least a day or two at each site, right? Laid out these things. None of these things ever existed all at once, right? In a single time or space, it happens sequentially. But to compress it all into the magazine image means that Smithson has compressed miles of travel, right? And hours and days of time. And to an extent, right? So if to Smithson, the sculpture is the whole thing, right? It is a sculpture of such a monumental size, because we're talking about, one place at the tip of the peninsula, say, and one place down here. These are hundreds and thousands of miles away, right? So it's a sculpture that is extraordinarily monumental. It's the size of like half a country, right? And then if you were to imagine, say, that all of these things existed at once, there'd still be no way to humanly experience the sculpture all at once, right? I could, if I got high enough in the air, if I look spaceship or Schmitz would love spaceships, by the way. If I got high enough in the air to like look down at the peninsula, these arrangements of mirrors will be too small to see. So what he's done is he's used photography to create an idea of a sculpture that can actually be experienced through the human senses. This is a bad pun, but I realize that's far out. Are you all on board with me?
Yeah.
With that idea? Okay. Other artists started using, like Eleanor Anton, started using photographs to create narrative. So this is one of my favorite works from this time. It's the postcard series, 100 Roots. And in this work, I'll show you a couple. Each of them, it's almost like a novel that's told in photographs that were originally sent out as postcards, like here. And each of them is 100 rubber boots go somewhere. So here they are turning a corner in suburban San Diego. Here they are at some kind of carnival backyard. Here they are hanging out, going the opposite direction as some ducks. Then visited some sort of tree here. And then finally, in 1973, they end up at the Museum of Modern Art. It happened to be an exhibition of all the postcards there, too. Obviously, this is a constructed photograph, right? Eleanor Anton went with her collaborators to these places. They set up the 100 booths to tell some sort of story. So this is no longer photography that's being used as a document, right? Or as a sort of transparent representation of something that happened. This is using photography still as conceptual art, still as a dematerialized object, right? I think Eleanor might still have the 100 boots in the garage somewhere, but they're in a box. This thing does not exist. It's a story. But it's kind of adapting what photographs can do. Or another example is Eve Klein's Leap into the Void from 1960. This is also what you might consider a fake photograph. It was done using, if Klein had actually done that with no mattress pillows, he would be dead. I mean, he is dead, but not held to the ground. He died later from a heart attack. So originally there was a mattress here, and it took about 6 or 7 tries to get it right. Because Klein wanted the final image, like for his face to kind of carry that sense of ecstasy, like leaping joyfully into the void. And then they kind of spliced the negatives together to make it look like he was leaping out into nothing. So any questions about this concept of dematerialization? I mean, in short, there is a sort of idea that the object is no more. And that you just have photographs and documents. A lot of artists use photographs simply to document massive or faraway artworks or performances. If you're an artist, you do need to make money, right? I can say, check out my art. But unless I photograph that and send it to a museum, it's not art anymore, right? It's just me taking over some hand sanitizer and then putting it back later, right? So as artists would use photographs, they stop using them only as documents and start kind of playing around with the properties of the medium. But they're doing it for very different reasons than what the fine art photographers are doing. So we're all on board with that? Okay. The second big sort of characteristic or movement or idea that you see across conceptual art is called the depth of the author. Now, have I talked about Roland Barthes in this class? I think I have.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit.
Little bit, okay. Well, it bears historicizing a little bit. Now, authorship has always been kind of like at play or in concern in photography since the technology was announced in 1839 France, right? Because whether or not photography is an art form often tends to devolve into what is the thing that creates the photograph, the person operating the camera or light reflecting off the object onto the screen, right? So there's always, it's always been a medium that lends itself to a complicated understanding or argument about authorship, right? We don't always know who or what authored the photograph, or at least it's arguable. Now, Roland Barthes, who in general tended to be interested in photography and wrote several books and several essays about it that we have, some of which we have encountered, also wrote about authorship. And in 1967 or so, he writes an essay called The Death of the Author. And it's published in a magazine called Aspen, it's volume 5+6, that was dedicated to conceptual art. And it hits conceptual artists in America like throwing a bomb into a bunker or something, right? It just blows up. And everybody's talking about the concept of the death of the author. So what Barthes suggests in this work is that in literary and artistic criticism, what people have always been looking for in an artwork is to understand the creative expression or vision of the artist, right? You read a book like Les Mis, and you read it thinking, what is Victor Hugo trying to tell me? You read a book like Harry Potter and Something Deathly Hallows, and you're like, what are J.K. Rowling's ideas? Barthes says, yeah, that's old. We're not doing that anymore. Instead, he suggests a text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning, the message of the author God. Instead, it's a multi-dimensional space in which a variety of writings, none of them original, blend in class. The explanation of a work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always, in the end, the voice of a single person, the author, confiding in us. And he says instead, the text is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. The writer can only imitate a gesture that is always anterior, never original. Did he wish, I'll get to the masculine pronoun in a second, did he wish to express himself, he ought to at least know that the inner thing he thinks to translate is itself only a ready-formed dictionary. What this means in Barthes, I love this writing, but it's dense, complicated, and poetic, and metaphorical. What this essentially means is that this idea of the author as a creative genius expressing themselves, and that we as the audience learning to understand that creative expression and being uplifted by it is piss pox. Barthes instead suggests that anything, any author or writer expresses, just like anything that normal quote unquote folk like myself might say, is we're always just copying things that we've already been seeing. Right? Everything in culture, every expression is recycling other expressions that are drawn from multiple and myriad sources. So that's what language is, right? And in the visual arts, the way that the death of the author started getting expressed often at first was one to turn to photography. Also, you start seeing works like the magazine Aspen itself that don't seem to give you much subjectivity or individuality. If you purchase this magazine, you got a white box, and they only made 500. You can see it's quite the expensive thing to get. It had film, it had essays, uh, photographs of artwork like Solowitz Serial Project #6 here. All of these kind of objects came together in a box, and they're all loose. So the box itself is very dry, right? It doesn't seem to express much of anything at all. It's just a white box, right? And then likewise, in that this work is loosely, it doesn't give you a particular order to approach it or to come to grips with the artwork, right? You can start by watching one of the films. You could are listening to one of the records. You could start by pulling out the essays and reading it yourself. You can remove one of these photographs and pin it up to your wall, and it's not part of the magazine anymore. It's your wall decoration. The way in which you approach the magazine is entirely up to you, right? So there's sort of a retreat of the artist is not trying to tell you how to experience the work anymore. And even, yeah. So that Solowitz serial project that came in, so you guys just saw the photographic documentation, how it really came, were these drawings, instructions for how to do it, measurements, ordering, you don't need to figure out all the math. But basically, based on this and some of the cutout papers that they gave you, you could construct serial project #1, or like a little kind of sculpture thing. So in this case, right, again, it's the artist's idea, but you yourself can make it so there's more of an interchange or a sharing of authority between the reader or the audience and the author. It's like if I invited you to come up here and start teaching. So you're right in front of the side. So in short, Bart says the classic or modern work is authored. We look for the author's expression in it, and we call it a work. But rather, instead, what we're starting to see is more contemporary or postmodern text in which the meaning of the work, what it means, is up for grabs by the reader, by any member of the audience. And so a work can have many interpretations. One example, I think a very famous example of this is Adrian Piper's work, Food for the Spirit from 1971. Piper makes this work in 71, but doesn't share it with anybody until 10 years later, and where she reproduces documentation of the work in the performance magazine, High Performance. Here. You can see some names you recognize, Eleanor Anton's right here, for example. So, Food for the Spirit was a private performance in Piper's loft. Just to give you guys some context, Piper at this time, in her early 20s, she was a philosophy student at CUNY, and had gotten to know Solowitz. They had studios right next to each other. And Piper's an extraordinarily intelligent person. If you ever read her, it's mind-blowing. Anyway, Piper, who's a graduate student of philosophy, becomes interested in the philosopher Immanuel Kant just so you have an idea of who he is, Kant's book, Critique of Pure Reason, is just like massive, 600-page tome. Kant's just like old white dude philosopher from the 1700s. Chapters are titled stuff like Preliminary Explanation of the Possibility of Categories as Knowledge a priori. You can imagine what that might be like to read. Anyway, so Piper decides she's going to take the summer, not really leave her apartment. She's going to come to grips with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And you can see these are her notes on it. She's reading it pretty carefully. At the same time, she does a juice fast. Every time she wants to, and every so often she'll take a break to do yoga. She's a pretty intense yogini as well. And I don't think it's that. But every time, you can imagine, you're reading something like the system of knowledge a priori, categories of reason, constructed, yada, yada, yada. You're reading that, you're really trying to understand it. You haven't eaten solid food in a week, right? You're only drinking juice. And you're doing yoga at headstands all the time. Imagine that, like, pretty frequently you would feel almost disembodied, right? Like you're all brain. You know how on those like late nights when you're cramming for an exam and you're like, I've lost track of how my body feels? It's just like that. And every time Piper felt like that, she would go to the mirror and take a photograph of herself. And so this happened about 14 times over the 2 weeks of the performance. So this has all of the sort of characteristics of conceptual art. There's a system, right? Piper's, I'm going to read this book. I'm doing the yoga and juice fasting, and when I feel disembodied, I'm going to photograph myself. And then the work, which nobody saw, right? There's just private in her loft, something a student does. I don't recommend a juice fast for coming to grips with a difficult touch, but it works for Piper. And then, right, so there's the system, there's the documentation of it. And then also, in the death of the author, right, here, Piper is the artist who created this work, but she's also the reader. Right? We're looking at a work that is about a reader coming to grips and coming to taking command or putting her own presence within the work of another author. Right? So the author and the reader, or the artist as author, and the reader become a lot much more overlapped in this work. Just like Eleanor Anton's carving, in which Anton is both artist and object of the artist's outline. Now, I'm going to return to this, but I'm just going to make a note of this for now. The fact that Piper, as a 22-year-old Black woman, is sort of taking over the work of Immanuel Kant, one of those dead white dude European philosophers, is significant. And I'm going to return to it in a minute. Because one of the things that I think we often forget about with conceptual art is that for many of the artists who participate in it, right, looking at this white box, you might think, there's some political, it's like, a white square, right? What do you do with that? But for many of the artists that participated in the movement, this was meant to be political and progressive. Just to give you an idea of what was going on in the 60s, I prepared a chronology. So, in 1962 is the March on Washington. 3 years later is the assassination of Malcolm X in February. This is 1965 alone. The next month after that is when the U.S. sends its first combat troops to Vietnam in the American War on Vietnam. It's also Bloody Sunday, when U.S. police beat savagely civil rights protesters in in the South. A month after that, there's another march on Washington to end the war in Vietnam. And June very artist report. That fall is the Watts Rebellion, which was a series of rebellions in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles that were in protest to the illegal and disproportionate seizure of a black vehicle driver, and they sent in the National Guard. You can see how somebody looking at this would see the sort of U.S. military presence both at home in the U.S., say, and also spread across the world. From 1966 to 68, we have the founding of the National Organization for Women, the founding of the Congress of Racial Equality, they passed a resolution on discriminatory drafting of, quote, minority groups in the court. The Black Panther Party and the Brown Berets were Chicana political activist group. That all happened in 1966. MLK Jr. and Muhammad Ali both announced the war the next year. There are rebellions, further rebellions after Washington, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, and elsewhere. By 1968, the war in Vietnam is ramping up, and the Tet Offensive, where many people died, as well as the massacre at Shanghai, which you may know as the My Lai massacre. So that was announced for another year or two. So it happened, but nobody knew about it in 68. MLK Jr. is assassinated. Students for a Democratic Society shut down Columbia University, and the Young Lords, which is a Puerto Ricano activist group, is also founded. The next year, the Chicano moratorium protests start in Los Angeles. The Art Workers Coalition forms. The U.S. starts bombing outside of Vietnam in Cambodia. Neil Armstrong walks on the moon, and the news of the massacre at Shanghai reaches the U.S. public. There's also the Stonewall Uprising, which is one of the first kind of open rebellions of GLBTQ individuals, and the organization, the Gay Liberation Front. You've probably heard people talk about Stonewall quite a bit already. In 1970 are the shootings at Kent State University, in which students, not unlike yourselves, who were protesting the war, were shot on by the National Guardsmen, and one student was killed. Sorry, I think there were actually 2 or 3 people killed. And Nixon agrees to a gradual withdrawal of troops. So it's a lot. And you may be wondering, what does a computer printout of words have to do with everything I just covered? That has a little bit something to do with it. The idea of the death of the author was political for many people, because what it meant was moving away from traditional or established sites of authority. Right? Feminists, for example, who had gotten their PhDs or degrees from universities, then they realized that all they learned was literature written by men. We're like, I'm burning my dissertation, because the university and other centers of authority, like the government, police, etc., was being very publicly challenged in by students, by artists. So this idea of the death of the author, that we start respecting or thinking about the interpretation or presence of the reader or audience, was a way of sort of decentering this, or seen as a way of decentering that authority. So in works like Alison Knowles and James Tenney's A House of Dust, which is one of the first poems kind of written by a spat out all of these stanzas. So, a house of leaves in a metropolis, using candles inhabited by friends, a house of paper in Japan, using electricity inhabited by children and old people. Right? So who's the author here? The people who wrote the program, or the computer who actually created the opera? All right. So for those of you who are computer nerds, this is using Fortran language. Now, again, to kind of keep our eyes on the ball here, as Objective-C, as this language as it was, this work often unthinkingly repeated systems of social power. So, for example, when it says inhabited by children and old people, we know that when they say children or old people, that they meant white children and white old people, because when they talk about Black Americans, they write a house of leaves in a desert using natural light, inhabited by, they use the word Negro, which was considered white back then, wearing all colors. Right? So when they identify difference, they identify racial difference. When they don't, they we know that they mean white people because they haven't identified it. Right? So these things keep, there's a lot of back and forth. We'll be getting to that. Okay. In terms of decentering authority, though, this poem, in fact, became its own classroom. When Knowles was invited to become a professor at Keller, which was then like Grandview University, right, they start a house of dust on open ground, lit by natural light, as you can see, inhabited by friends and enemies. It's a pretty good description of going to art school. You're going to like some people and you're not going to like others, and enemies. And what this became was a space for students to do their own thing. You can see here on the bottom image in the house of dust, the students are having some kind of music and balloon launching party. They're watching a film late at some other time. And where is the profession? Or where's the authority of the situation? It's a trick question, you can't see it, right? It doesn't seem to exist. This is a structure that's not like the one that we're in today, right? Where all of your chairs are centered around listening to like one or two people up here. But rather, it's a smaller group of everybody kind of at the same level, chatting with each other, creating work out of their conversations, and so forth. This is very like feminist and conceptual art of space and feminist politics. So that this sort of group of students in the circle sitting on the ground looks like a feminist conscience raising session is probably not accidental. So in the 1970s, the movement that we know as feminism started a white, black, and brown, and Asian woman who get involved in the anti-war movement and in the civil rights movement, and that yet find that because of their gender, they are still experiencing gender-based discrimination. So, for example, women like Barbara Smith or Gloria Anzaldúa, they are joining with organizations like the Students for Democratic Society, but the men are all writing position papers and giving speeches, and the women are like, go get the coffee, honey. And by the way, it's free love time, so I get to bring you too. That was more or less exactly what was said to us, right? So a lot, for women, gender-based discrimination wasn't changing. Even when early attempts to call out the men in these organizations that they were in, like Black Panthers, like Students for Democratic Society, fell on deaf ears, and so feminists started forming their own groups. One of the practices that feminist organizations started getting together is called the consciousness raising session. And what would happen is that you put a group of about anywhere between like 4 to 12 women. You meet pretty regularly. You sit around like telling, just talking about your life, like going to therapy or something like that. You're like, this happened, it really bothered me, or my husband's doing this, or somebody like followed me on the street, whatever. And the other woman in the room be like, okay, something similar like that happened to me too. And you find telling these stories that these experiences it wasn't you or it wasn't your fault, but rather it was a system that tended to look down on women. And so to sort of shift from, people in the circle learning as equals, right, learning together, and that the insights they gather are coming from their lives, and then figuring out what to do about it. One of the artworks that sprung from this system famously is called Woman House, and I've got a little documentation of it to show you here. So, hold on.
Transformed into an environmental art piece. Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, and their students from the California Institute of the Arts used consciousness-raising sessions to search out and reveal the female experience and to produce theater pieces which they wrote and performed. They explored these new feelings about themselves and about women's role in the home until they created before the eyes of the public the longings, fears, and dreams women have as they cook, sew, wash, and iron their lives away.
So this is the audience that invited into the house. The group of women that were involved in the feminist art program at CalArts was organized by 2 feminist art professors, Judy Chicago, Miriam Shapiro, and later Sheila DeBrettville. And each class was kind of like a consciousness raising session. They left the University of CalArts itself because they figured that was a very male-dominated space. CalArts was funded by Disney, so you could certainly imagine why they believe that, right? And they take over this house, and each room becomes, and then collaborative meditation. In this particular case, mainly white women's issues because of all white women in the group. We'll get back to that later. Other artists use photography to enter the woman's home. and also blended anti-war and feminist concerns. So one example is Martha Rosler's photo collage, Tron Amputee, which she made originally as a flyer to hand out at marches. But you would go to these anti-war marches run by students, and in no way am I looking down at students. But you know, you all have to write a lot of essays, right? So you can imagine that the anti-war league that students might put out would involve a lot of essays, right? And that's exactly what happened, right? In the street wall journal, can you imagine somebody coming up to you with this on the street and being like, here, read this and fight the war? I'd be like, no, you go that way. I don't like people handing me stuff on the street. You guys can laugh at that, whatever. Anyway, so Rosler is like, we need something more pictorial. We need something that gets the message across, but does it in, you know, the way an image can really like kind of grab you by the, you know, hair and make you think about something. And so what she does is a series of collages that combine media images from magazines. In this case, the cover of Life magazine, with, so she cut out the figure of Trump and put it on a page of ripped out from like a House Beautiful magazine. Like a kind of fancy, modern home. You can tell that whoever lives here probably has access to house cleaning help, because that is a light carpet and it's hard to keep clean, right? And you know, a fair amount of money. So it's a fancy looking home. And this is, you know, I think for one thing, this is the cover of Life magazine in 1968. So in its time, when Straussler handed you this to you, you would recognize this story, right? Everybody got Life magazine. Everybody knew what had happened to this young Vietnamese refugee whose name may still be alive, Nguyen Thi Trump. So it has that sort of recognizability quotient. As the story goes, Tron had actually already been relocated by the U.S. Army once. A lot of Vietnamese villagers, even leading up to the Marines landing at Da Nang, were moved out of the villages where they and their ancestors had lived for many years into sort of more easily fortified hamlets. These were called like resettlement towns or something. But anyway, you know, conditions were bad, food was short, all of that. Tron goes outside of the village and searches for like sticks and vegetables and stuff for her family. And she goes with two friends and an older man. Where she happens to go was an area that the U.S. Army had called, decided to make what they called a free fire zone. And what that meant was that it was a zone which the Army said, if it moves in this zone, we shoot. We don't ask questions, we don't wait. Hence the word free fire. Trump, not speaking English, so was 12 years old, I guess didn't get the memo, and goes into this free fire zone. A U.S. Army helicopter is passing above. They see her and the people she's with, and they just start shooting. So Tron loses her leg. Another 12-year-old girl that she was with got scraped along the belly, and she survived. The older man died, and I think the boy survived, if I recall correctly. The helicopter lands, like check it out, and realize they were shot down by the kids, and rush them to the hospital. They don't think to go to the village to try to find their parents, but luckily Tron's mother, which doesn't like to see her kid hurt and dead, finds Tron in the hospital at the nearest city. And And that's where the photojournalist Larry Burroughs meets Tron as well, and does this photojournalist essay on her as she won. As you can see, she lost her leg, and they made her a new one. And then he follows her back to the settlement village. So this is one of those kind of earlier in the war, you still, the U.S. government had there's a lot of crackdown on sort of negative reporting in the late 60s. And this is one of those sort of early examples in the media where it obviously does not reflect well on the U.S. Army and their practices. Now, Rossler, in making this collage, it's not just something that she's handing out at anti-war protests. She puts it in this feminist newsletter called Goodbye to All That. You can see this was one of those rare feminist groups that was a little bit more mixed in terms of race and sexuality than many. Right, they're fighting on behalf of Chicana and Latina and or Mexican American women in the area as well. You can read in the cover. And then on the back is this magazine, or is this flyer. If you can imagine, right, you go to the grocery store, you get handed a copy of Goodbye to All That. You're let's just say you're a woman or a man, whatever. You go home and you dump it on your coffee table or on the chair at the top by your door, roll up a mail and magazines. And this was the 1960s. We didn't have our phones or email. There was a lot more kind of paper stuff floating around the home. And this is, right, it looks like a newspaper. It's copied from Life magazine. It almost fits in the stuff that you might go home with. And then very quickly, a second glance and you realize, right, that the sort of comforts of the U.S. home are fueling the U.S. violence in Vietnam, right? This fancy, modern, beautiful light carpet home, the reason the U.S. went to Vietnam in the first place was to like shore up capitalism, which they, you guys know about the domino theory? Okay. So it's challenging the sort of lifestyle decisions that you make, and instead of kind of do so in the gallery, right, it's using that dematerialization of the object, that depth of the author to kind of make you deal with this issue in the space of your own home. Now, we're getting close to the end of class. I've touched a little bit on, through all of this, how the politics of identity start messing with conceptual art, and how some of these ideas like dematerialization of the death of the author don't function in the same ways for all people. In the lecture that I will record and post in the next 2 days, I will discuss that in more depth, focusing on the body in conceptual art, which is no less or more conceptual than anything else. And I'll be talking about the work of Anna Mendieta, Adrian Piper, and a number of others. So we'll also take up that issue next week in discussing the pictures generation. All right, that's it for me. Thanks for listening. I had a lot to say today, clearly. Have a lovely weekend. See you at the Captioning. Thank you.